Thank you for coming. I'm thrilled to introduce Michael Lewis. He doesn't know it, but I've been a fan of his for about 20 years. When he first wrote Liar's Poker, which if you haven't read it is sort of a scathing account of life on Wall Street, which of course isn't what I chose to do when I graduated about the same time as he did. I came here and we love to make fun of everyone on Wall Street, so he's very googly and fits right in. One of my favorite books that he wrote was Moneyball. And that too was very googly. It basically talks about applying data to decisions in baseball. He then later wrote an article about applying data to the NBA and has some anecdotes about this year's Laker-Houston series, which he can talk about. I think you could actually make an argument that his book had more influence on baseball than any book in history because some of the management and coaches are actually paying attention to his book. So if you haven't read it, you should get a look at that. His latest book is called Home Game, and I'm interested to see if he actually figures out how to use data to make decisions there, because I haven't read it, but I understand it's about fatherhood. So, Michael, thank you for joining us.
So, I've got this right. I'm going to talk for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up, and it's up to them. Right? Okay. So I thought, what I would do. This book that I just published came out last week, and it's a bastard child of a book. It was never really meant to exist, and I just was I was going to read a little passage from it, but I was going to sort of explain how it came about. It treats fatherhood much as I treated Wall Street, and this is what happened. I impregnated my wife 11 years ago, and had really the only model in my head of fatherhood was the one I was raised with. I'm very close to my own father, but when my own father had a real gift for not doing any of the dirty work, and he once watched me change a diaper with this kind of perplexity, and after I was finished, he looked at me. He said, "I didn't even talk to you till you were 21," and so I had no role model for the new fatherhood, and where fathers were supposed to be involved, and so on and so forth. And I had a very diligent wife who would pile up the books about fatherhood beside my bed that I was meant to read before we had our first child. And I went through them all and felt rather prepared, but then found that when I got into the actual experience, there was nothing, no one had described it to me. And much as no one had described Wall Street to me. And this is the seeds of literary material. When you have an experience and it feels so different from how you've been prepared to feel, there's something that needs to be made sense of. And I didn't at first think I was going to write about it for public consumption. What I did in the beginning was kind of 4 or 5 months into it, I realized that when I encountered people who were about to have babies, I was already starting to lie about what it had been like when the baby came out. And I was sanitizing it and making it much more pleasant than it actually was. And I thought, so I have a record of what I actually thought and felt. I wanted to start keeping a journal of the experience. And so that's what I did. And then I started showing it, bits and pieces of it, to my wife. And some of the things I was writing were kind of truly appalling. But nevertheless, they were what I felt. And I was surprised how relieved she was when she read these things, because she'd come to view her husband as this black box and couldn't understand completely the signals that were coming out of it. And here I was finally explaining it to her. And so she started to look forward to getting these pages at the end of a week and kind of reading through. Cut to a few months later, and I'm having a conversation with the editor of Slate, the online magazine, Jacob Weisberg. And Jacob has just become a father. And he and I start to commiserate about how our lives have been destroyed by these little things that have been introduced to them. And Jacob wasn't as self-pitying as me, but he recognized that this was material. And so he said, we'll run some of this journal. And so what I did over the last 10 years, 9.5 years, I have 3 children now. They're aged 10, 7, and 2. The first year after the child was born, I was diligent about if something happened that seemed relevant to the experience, I would go and write it down. And Jacob published some of these things. But I never thought that this was going to go anywhere further than that. And the things that I published in Slate generated quite a bit of controversy. I mean, people thought they were funny, but some people were upset with them. But I didn't. Again, it was just little web articles. I didn't pay much attention to it. A year ago, my literary agent's wife got sent by a friend basically the stack of things I had written online over the 9 years, and she read them through and was laughing in bed when she was reading them. And her husband, my agent, said, "What are you reading?" And she said, "Well, your client has written this thing." And he had no idea I'd done this. And he started reading it. And he called me and he said, "There's a book in this." I said, "You got to be kidding me." He said, "No, read it." And so he sent me my own stuff. I have, of course, forgotten all of it, because you forget everything that happens the first year after you have a child. And I was reading it. It was like reading about a different person. But it was interesting to me for a couple of reasons. One was the material was very rich, and it was even richer than I had imagined when I put it down on the page. And two, it had a natural narrative to it. You could see this character who starts out a perfect Neanderthal, learning a bit about how to do this thing called fatherhood and developing. And it didn't take that much to glue them together, to pick the best ones and write in a long introduction and a long ending to it, and have something that looked, that actually was kind of fun. And so that's how it came about. I found when I was going through it that one of the things that emerged from the material that I hadn't been completely conscious of as I was writing the journal was that I was constantly being surprised by my own feelings. Right from the beginning, not being terribly attached to the baby when the baby was born was a shock to me. And it took a while to get over that shock and to realize that paternal love was something, in my case, that was going to be learned rather than something I was born with. And it came through the caring of the child. But over and over, I found myself feeling kind of inappropriate things. And part of why I was writing that thing, the journal obviously, was to rationalize my own feelings to myself. And the little passage I'm going to read before we have our conversation was a passage I wrote when I realized for the first time in my life as a father I had that bursting with pride feeling you're supposed to feel when your child says their first word or walks for the first time. But I didn't have it until my eldest child was 6. And it wasn't about my eldest child. We were on vacation. We're at a fancy hotel in Bermuda. Like fancy hotels everywhere, the place is paying new attention to the whims of small children. The baby pool is vast, nearly as big as the pool for the grown-ups, to which it is connected by a slender canal. In the middle of the baby pool is a hot tub, just for little kids. My 2 daughters, now ages 6 and 3, leap from the hot tub into the baby pool and back again. The pleasure they take in this could not be more innocent or pure. Then out of nowhere come 4 older boys, 10, maybe 11 years old. As anyone who has only girls knows, boys add nothing to any social situation but trouble. These 4 set on proving the point. Seeing my little girls, they grab the pool noodles, intended to keep 3-year-olds afloat, and wheel them as weapons. They descend upon Quinn, my 6-year-old, whacking the water on either side of her until she's almost in tears. I'm hovering in the canal between the baby pool and the grown-up pool, wondering if I should intervene. Dixie beats me to it. Dixie's the 3-year-old. She jumps out in front of her older sister and thrusts out her 3-year-old chest. "Teasing boys," she hollers, so loudly that the grown-ups around the pool peer over their Daniel Steele novels. Even the boys are taken aback. Dixie, now on stage, raises her voice up a notch. "You just shut up, you stupid motherfucking assholes." To the extent that all hell can break loose around a baby pool in a Bermuda resort, it does. A Jonathan Grisham novel is lowered. Several of Danielle Steele's vanish into beach bags. I remain hovering in the shallows of the grown-up pool, where it enters the baby pool, with my entire head above water. My first thought, oh my God. My second thought, no one knows I'm her father. I sink lower like a crocodile so that just my eyes and forehead are above the waterline. But in my heart, a new feeling rises. Pride. Behind me, a lady on a beach chair shouts, "Kevin! Kevin, get over here!" Kevin appears to be one of the noodle-wielding 11-year-old boys. "But Mom," he says, "Kevin now!" The little monster sulks over to his mother's side while his fellow orcs await the higher judgment. I'm close enough to hear her ream him out. It's delicious. "Kevin, did you teach that little girl those words?" she asks. "Mom, no." "Then where did she learn them?" As it happens, I know the answer to that one. Carpool. Months ago, I was driving them home from school, my 2 girls plus 2 other kids, a 7-year-old boy and a 10-year-old girl. They were crammed in the back seat of the Volkswagen Passat, jabbering away. I was alone in the front seat, not especially listening. But then the 10-year-old said, "Dina said a bad word today." "Which one?" asked Quinn. "The S word," said the 10-year-old. "Ooh," they all said. "What's the S word?" I asked. "We can't say it without getting into trouble," said the 10-year-old knowingly. "You're safe here," I said. She thought it over for a second and then said, "Stupid." "Ah," I said, smiling. "Wally said the D word," said Quinn. "What's the D word?" I asked. "Dumb," she shouted, and they all giggled at the sheer illicit pleasure of it. Then the 7-year-old boy chimed in. "I know a bad word too. I know a bad word too," he said. "What's the bad word?" I asked brightly. I didn't see why he should be left out. "Shut up, you stupid motherfucking asshole." I swerved off the road, stopped the car, and hit the emergency lights. I began to deliver a lecture on the difference between bad words and seriously bad words. But the audience was fully consumed with laughter. Dixie especially wanted to know the secret of making Daddy stop the car. "Shut up, mother, stupid fuck," she said. "Dixie," I said. "Daddy," said Quinn thoughtfully, "how come you say a bad word when we spill something, and when you spill something, you just say oops?" "Stupid fuck," screamed Dixie, and they all laughed. "Dixie," I said. She stopped. They all did. For the rest of the drive, they just whispered. So here we are, months later, in this Bermuda pool. Dixie with her chest thrust out in defiance, me floating like a crocodile and feeling very much different than I should. I should be embarrassed and concerned. I should be sweeping her out of the pool and washing her mouth out with soap. But I don't feel that way. Actually, I'm impressed, more than impressed, awed. It's just incredibly heroic, taking out after this rat pack of boys. Plus, she's sticking up for her big sister, which isn't something you see every day. I don't want to get in her way. I just want to see what happens next. Behind me, Kevin has just finished being torn what appears to be a new asshole by his mother and is relaunching himself into the baby pool with a real malice. He's as indignant as a serial killer who just got put away on a speeding ticket. He's guilty of many things, but not of teaching a 3-year-old girl the art of cursing. Now he intends to get even. Gathering his fellow orcs in the hot tub, he and his companions once again threaten Quinn. Dixie once again leaps into the fray. "Teasing boys," she shouts. Now she has the attention of an entire Bermuda resort. "You watch out, teasing boys, because I peed in this pool 2 times. Once in the hot pool and once in the cold pool." The teasing boys flee, grossed out and defeated. Various grown-ups say various things to each other, but no one seeks to remove Dixie from the baby pool. Dixie returns to playing with her sister, who appears far less grateful than she should be. And the crocodile drops below the waterline, swivels and vanishes into the depths of the grown-up pool. But he makes a mental note to buy that little girl an ice cream cone, even if her mother disapproves. So why don't I'll stop with that. That gives you a flavor. And we don't have to talk about this book. We can talk about magazine articles or other books or whatever you'd like to talk about. But you're going to have to lead the conversation. No, I didn't think so.
So the last time you were here, I asked a question about who you would rather, or if you had the choice, whether you would rather be you or Billy Bean, in reference to...
I remember this.
So with the advent of, I guess, what is the Moneyball movie coming out, I suppose the question this time is, given the choice, who would you want to be you?
Well, but you know, the Moneyball movie doesn't have me in it. The Moneyball movie has gone through many iterations in the last 5 years. And there was an unfortunate draft of the script where I was close to the main character. And it was so bad, though, that there was not any risk it was going to be made. What they've done instead is much closer to the book. And I'm not really in the book, except to listen. And they don't really need me for the movie. In many ways, they don't need me for the movie, but as a character, they don't need me. So they don't have me. What's interesting about what they've done with the movie is, with the exception of Billy Bean, who's being played by Brad Pitt, and Paul DePodesta, his right-hand man, who's being played by Dimitri Martin, much of the rest of the cast are the actual people. Steven Soderbergh is directing it, and he's decided that he's going to push the boundaries between fact and fiction, to the point that the movie is set in the Oakland A's 2002 season, just like the book. He has hired and reassembled the entire 2002 Oakland A's team and got them back in their old uniforms. I was supposed to go from here to Seattle and have dinner tonight with Scott Hatterberg, the former first baseman, and I got an email from him saying, I'm going to be shooting my scenes down in Hollywood. And I said, your scenes? He says, yeah, I've got these scenes in this movie. And he said, this Soderbergh guy is supposed to be a genius, but he's hiring all us to act in it. How smart can he be? You know? But it's going to be very interesting to see how he does it, because he really is, he's pushing envelopes here with the way he's casted. But so there's no answer to your question, because I'm not in it. I had a shot, I thought, on last weekend of actually being in the movie of The Blind Side. You know, the football book, that's being filmed too right now in Atlanta. It's ahead of Moneyball. It comes out in November, and it's mostly filmed, and I was there on the set. But actually, getting yourself into one of your movies is a huge pain in the ass. You have to sit around. What actors do, it's so tedious. You have to sit for hours and hours and wait for the moment where, you know, you're in the stands and the camera pans over you, kind of thing. And so I just abandoned it. I stayed for an hour and left. So me and the movie is not going to happen, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you.
Hi there, thanks for coming today. I'm interested in your reaction to the Amazon Kindle as a distribution device for books, and particularly the pricing model that Amazon's using to price them at $9.99 for the most part. The books, what that means to you as an author.
Well, in the short term, nothing. The authors get exactly the same cut of the book, the same amount for a Kindle sale as an actual book sale. I can't believe in the long run there is not going to be some negotiation that takes place. But in the short run, Amazon's been very careful not to offend the authors. I was given one of those Kindles by Amazon when it was being demoed, and I don't assimilate new technology well. It usually takes me a long time. Like new kids, it takes me a long time before I get my mind around the fact this thing is supposed to be in my life, and I'm supposed to make do, you know, accommodate it. The Kindle was a huge exception. When I got it, I was instantly reading, and now I don't go anywhere without it, books and newspapers on it. And it's really clear that this is the future of my publishing life. I mean, the books will still exist and as objects, but increasingly the sales are going to be going through the Kindle. I really like that they're paying me as much for my Kindle sales as for the real sales, but it has, you know, authors don't see this right now. They haven't been cut out yet.
Hi there. So you've written about the finance industry, and I'm wondering if you feel that you have any insights or expertise you've developed there that allows you to comment on kind of economic policy and what's going on right now, and just kind of the macroeconomic forces in play that we're seeing right now.
You got people in the room who could do that much better than I could. But the financial crisis interests me greatly, and I have a lot to say about that. I'm writing a book about it. My first book was set on Wall Street, and it was Liar's Poker, and it was I thought going to be this little message in the bottle to future generations who would never believe how outrageous Wall Street got in the 1980s. I really thought that it was good. It was the end of an era when I wrote it, and I thought that in part because I just couldn't believe any system that paid me to dispense financial advice could sustain itself, and I really didn't. And there were many people around me who were even less qualified for the job than I was. So it just seemed preposterous at the time, and that it not only continued, but got to the point where the kind of what happened in the 1980s seemed quaint in retrospect. Caused me to re-engage when it all finally came collapsing down. So I've spent a lot of time in the last 6 months wandering around talking to people, trying to figure out how to tell this story. And I think I've figured out how to do that. I haven't finished it, kind of in it, and there's several angles of attack to your question. If you're asking me broadly what I think is going to happen in the economy, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. It intrigues me, actually, generally. You probably get this all the time as an economist, how much people want you to predict things that are essentially unpredictable. This happens. In book tours, you do have to do things like go on CNBC's Power Lunch, and they want you to tell them what you think the price of oil is going to do. And there are 8 people who are willing to tell you what the price of oil is going to do. And just come on with total certainty and say it's going to be at $100 a barrel in 6 months. If they thought that, why are they on CNBC? They should go make their fortune buying barrels of oil. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. I do think there's a lot to be said about what has happened that hasn't been said. There's a lot of really interesting narrative journalism to do about how we got to where we are. One aspect of it that really intrigues me is there is you notice this, if you pay very close attention to the public statements and the public posture of the people who ran the big Wall Street firms, people who have been fingered as sort of culprits one way or another, you see that they think of themselves often as victims. They think of themselves as people who got washed away by a tsunami that no one saw coming, and that they really shouldn't be held accountable for this because since nobody saw it coming, why should they be expected to see it coming? And this is clearly not true. People did see it coming, and not just people who go on CNBC and talk about it. They're investors, a handful of investors, who reposition themselves looking at hard facts to make a lot of money off the collapse of the financial markets, especially the collapse of the subprime mortgage market. And what's intriguing is how upside down the financial world became. The only people, there was a point, mid-2006 to mid-2007, where the only people who were doing serious credit analysis of the loans that were being made in the mortgage market were the people who were doing it so they could find the best ones to sell short. And that is bizarre. The people who were making the loans were not paying nearly as much attention to what they were doing as the people who were going to bet against them. You've got to think about that. Another angle of attack to your question is how the government has approached the problem of dealing with the wreckage. And I'm one of the people who's a little appalled by it. I mean, I really had hoped that the Obama administration would take a different attack than the Bush administration did. And I don't understand, in particular, why the starting point when faced with a failed financial institution is to assume that, one, it can't be nationalized, and two, its creditors can't take any sort of hit at all. And once you make those assumptions, you're left with only one option, and that's what they're doing, gifting money to banks until they are solvent again. And since there's no political will to actually write this check of the size that it needs to be written, which is trillions, it has to be done surreptitiously. It has to be done sneakily, which seems to me an unsustainable way of doing it. I might be wrong about this, but because it's essentially a sneaky process, the flow of information from the people who might be in a position to know about what actually is going on inside these institutions is very poor. I've been working on a big piece about AIG. AIG is at the center. It's one of the institutions that's most intriguing to explore. I've been spending a lot of time interviewing people in the little unit inside AIG called AIGFP, which is supposedly responsible for, depending on which account you read, $50 billion, $100 billion, $180 billion of losses. Talking about a handful of traders in London and Connecticut. I've talked to, not all of them, but a lot of them. And invariably, when I sit down to talk to them, they tell me, you're the first person who's asked me a question. The Treasury hasn't been here, the Fed hasn't been here, our new CEO hasn't been here. Nobody's asking us any questions. Nobody actually wants to know what happened. Now, that's shocking. I mean, that just tells you a lot. So you asked a broad question. That's an attempt to narrow it.
So I really like and admire the spirit of the book because it punctures the myth of fatherhood and this pseudo archetype that's transformed since the time of your father. So thank you for that, because I found as a new father, a lot of those books is just totally empty rhetoric, and you're supposed to hold the hand of your wife as she's giving birth and give her a lavender pillow and all of that stuff, which is just totally...
Where do you think that comes from?
Well, I was going to ask you that, but...
Yeah, but
let's grab a beer and...
But it's an interesting question, right?
Yeah.
Where all these instructions come from, because they're new.
Yeah.
You know, my father didn't read those things. The world's changed. Is that the question you were going to ask?
Well, I did want to get your perspective on that, but the other part was it's taking private thoughts public.
Yeah.
And you're representing, sharing your feelings, disclosing your feelings, and you're
very
also
unmanly.
You're representing your kids in here. So I'm curious if you and your wife had to reconcile that, of making their lives either not so much public, but your feelings of that, and being like, is my son going to be in therapy for the rest of his life because, of X, Y, and Z?
Yeah,
did you have to reconcile that, or is that just part of your occupation that you think?
No, there's several answers to that question. The truth is that when I started doing this, we had a 6-month-old or a 5-month-old, and it was so much more about me than this thing that had come into our life. And it was going to be her prehistory. She was not going to have any memory of it or really any kind of ownership of it. It was just going to be this period that would have gone undocumented. And it was hard to imagine how writing about her as a 5-month-old was going to scar her. The second answer is that, and this may just tell you something about my relationship with my children, and what I imagined it would be when I was writing about it, is that the minute the galley of this thing came in, the first person to grab it was that child, who's now 10, who took it into a room, came out 5 minutes later, we got to talk. All right? So about what? He says, there's some really bad words in here, you got to take those out. And she'd read that first thing, you can't write those words. And I said, well, sometimes it's okay. But then she took it back into the room. Now it was okay. She took it back in the room, and all that came out of that room were howls of laughter. And then she grabbed her sister and then he read parts of it to her sister. It's been a delight for them to have this part of their lives documented. I said on the Daily Show the other night, it seemed to appall Jon Stewart when he kind of hinted at this question. I said I wasn't so worried about the effect I was going to have on my children writing about them. I was more worried about what would happen when I stopped writing about them, because when they ceased to be material, I had no interest in them. And it was a joke, right? But it was absolutely true that this was an incentive structure that was very useful to me in those early days. It gave me an excuse not to pay attention to, but to pay attention to with a kind of acuteness, and it really enriched our relationship before they knew we had a relationship. So it always felt okay. Having said that, I'm done. As my wife, when the book has, when it first started getting reviews, and I was on the TV talking about it 10 days ago. At one point she turned to me. We were on the Today Show together, and when we left, she turned to me. She said, "You're not going to turn our life into a reality TV show, are you?" I said, "No, I promise you." That's the closest we've had to a discussion about it. Now, the part that was a little sensitive was her, the parts about her, because she was incredibly indulgent about almost all of it. But the part that hit a nerve was interesting. Childbirth is an unbelievably traumatic experience. You've been through it. Now, modern medicine can make it seem not so traumatic, but even so, if you just think for a minute when you're watching the doctors do what they do, what would have happened if they weren't there, you realize the body is going through something that might well kill it. My wife would have died with our first child if she had not had medical care. The second child would have died in childbirth had the doctors not been there. The third time through, it went the way it goes in the books. Everything was fine. We left the hospital early. We thought the baby was sleeping. We thought, oh my God, this is how it works this is why nobody talked about it. This is how it's supposed to go. We get home. It's 2 in the morning. We have the other girls downstairs. We've sent the neighbors back home. We're back in our bed. I'm sleeping, baby's sleeping, and my wife's fingernails go into my arm. And I wake up, and she has this look on her face. It's described in the book. I've never seen anything like it. She was absolutely terrified. She thought we were all going to die. She thought right now, she was like a character. She looked like a character in a horror movie who was about to be the victim. She had this. She couldn't be alone. I had to stay awake. We had with her. She couldn't close her eyes without having things. So we went down and Googled. Actually, we went down to our computer, opened it up, typed in panic, postpartum, and sure enough, up pops an academic paper on postpartum panic attacks. And it's riveting if you're not going through it. But it's that. She went insane this lasted weeks. And the aftershocks of this hormonal response lasted a year. When I went to write about that, she was sensitive, because she was still feeling a little crazy, and she didn't want me talking about it. But she then took a deep breath and she said, "Why didn't we know about this? We've been through this 3 times now, and nobody made me mention this, and it happens to a meaningful number of women, and it just falls in the category of many things they don't tell you. There's such a variety of experience out there to be had, and it is such a traumatic experience. That was the one time we had a conversation where, I'm not sure I want you to write about that. If she'd said no, I would have done it, obviously. But she came to the conclusion that it would be useful for someone to have a description of what this is like, because it's so bizarre. So we're easy about it. But I'm not doing this anymore. This was it.
So the Steven Strasberg situation, where a team is basically prepared to throw $50 million at a completely untested kid.
Yes.
A lot of people are talking about how that sort of highlights the issues you wrote about in Moneyball, like the gap between high-income and lower-income teams.
Right.
Do you think that that's finally going to be some kind of catalyst for change in the way
that the Steven Strasburg is going to be a catalyst? No, I think that this has happened so often. Baseball has become inured to this sort of situation where a superstar comes along in the draft and Scott Boras negotiates a deal for him, and the team gets. Well, the team is just taking all the risk. Is basically a transfer of risk, and there's a huge amount of risk. There was a piece Alan Schwartz did in the New York Times a few days ago, listing the Steven Strasburgs, the great pitchers that can't miss college or high school pitchers that have come into the draft in previous years, and none of them work out. They all got hurt. So, what I think is going to drive baseball now, I think that baseball is approaching slowly a point of crisis. Money became a bigger and bigger issue with free agency. The gaps between rich and poor are permanent. The Yankees are always going to have more money than the Tampa Bay Rays. As long as there were inefficiencies in the market, it didn't matter as much. In that a team like the Oakland A's could find a better way of doing things and reduce the importance of money, eliminate the importance of money, of the money gap. The inefficiencies are quickly being removed from the market. Once those are gone, the rich teams will have a shocking advantage. And I think eventually what's going to happen is there's going to have to be a restructuring of the game along the lines of the NBA and the NFL, or else it is just going to be the rich team wins every year, or one of the rich teams wins every year. And I assume that will happen, but I also assume it won't. But I assume it won't happen until there's a crisis. That there's some noticeable decline in fan interest, and it gets attributed to these imbalances, and the owners get together and said, we need parity. Parity is what keeps people interested. But I think it's going to be a ways. I think we're talking a decade off.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed your recent basketball article on Battier and Daryl Morey. Jonathan mentioned you had a few tidbits on the Lakers-Rockets series. Maybe you could share a few.
Oh, sure. No,
and also, could you maybe compare Billy Beane and Daryl Morey? Just curious.
Okay. The piece he's talking about was a New York Times Magazine piece about Shane Battier, who plays for the Houston Rockets. And it came about mainly because I kept waiting for someone else to write it, and they didn't do it. But when Moneyball came out, it was seized on first, not by baseball front offices, but by first Wall Street, and then the front offices in other sports. And one of the people who was really interested in it was Daryl Morey, who's now the general manager of the Houston Rockets. And Morey was already, trying to find new and better statistics to measure what happened on a basketball court. And basketball is particularly challenging. Baseball is such a clean statistical environment. It's so easy to isolate and assign credit and blame on a baseball field compared to the other sports. And in basketball, it's very difficult. And basketball has got this problem that it's got these historic statistics that don't tell you very much. Points and rebounds and assists. They just don't tell you very much about the player's contribution to the team's success. And Daryl Morey told me, I don't know, 3 years ago, whenever he became the GM of the Rockets, I guess it was almost 3 years ago, that the first move he had made was to trade for Shane Battier. And he'd done it because when he was in the front office of the Celtics, where Morey had been before, they had developed pretty crude statistics, but more useful statistics, where they were trying to measure a player's effect, not a player's points, rebounds, and assists, but his effect on everyone else on the court. What he did for his team's scoring and rebounds and assists, and what he did, how he affected the other teams, the opponents' scoring and rebounds and assists. And what he found was that some players popped up who didn't actually have very impressive conventional statistics, but they had a huge effect on their fellow players. So they were the great team player. And people always say it's a team sport, but actually, if you watch the NBA, it's not run like it's a team sport. It's run like a sport of superstars, and everybody subordinates themselves to the wishes of the team superstar. Well, here was a guy who was finding a way to behave like a team player, even though the market wasn't encouraging him to be a team player. Nobody was perceiving what he was doing. But Morey had, and he traded for him. And it was regarded at the time as a scandalous trade in Houston. Everybody said it was a bad trade. But the Rockets have become extremely successful. And Daryl Morey will tell you that Shane Battier is right at the center of the reason they're successful, even though you don't see it. I mean, it's hard to see it. So I wrote about, Battier let me into his life a bit, and I wrote about his experience. And I used, as a frame for the piece, an encounter between Battier and Kobe Bryant. Daryl Morey argued with statistics that Battier had been more effective guarding Kobe Bryant than anybody in the NBA. Even though Battier is not much of a natural athlete, and nobody had really thought of him as much of he was an okay defensive player. He's now gotten a lot more credit very recently. And Kobe Bryant is the superstar. And nobody stops Kobe Bryant, kind of thing. And so I built the piece around the next game they played each other, and showed how Battier thought about guarding Kobe Bryant. And how he thought about it was driven. Part of it was instinctive, but part of it had been informed by the analysis done in the Rockets front office. That the Rockets gave him a grid of the court, and they showed the probability of Bryant making a shot from here versus here versus here versus here, and in different circumstances, off the dribble, off a pass, off a pick and roll, so on and so forth. And Battier's whole approach was to drive Kobe Bryant to the place where he was relatively the weakest. He was always going to get his shots. He was always going to get his points. You just tried to make him inefficient. And in making him inefficient, he was actually able to make Kobe Bryant a liability to the Lakers. And so I write this article. And it's very funny when you write about professional athletes. None of them want to admit they read. None of them want to admit they read. It's a bad thing to read if you're a professional athlete. And they never want to admit that anything, unless it's grotesque, some grotesque personal insult has entered their life. But Phil Jackson, before the Rockets played the Lakers in the playoffs, apparently gave Kobe Bryant a copy of the article to goad him, to show him what the Rockets were doing to make him a liability. And he read it. And he was hollering at Battier about this thing through the series. And you could see it. It was hysterical what he was doing. You say you can guard me, but you can't guard me. It was everything but on page 46 of the New York Times Magazine, you said this and that's not true. And it was like he was fact-checking the article on the court. And so I got a couple of funny emails from Battier during the series. It was the first really I'd heard from him. I heard from him once after the piece came out. And one of them said that, this article is following me around the court, kind of thing. And so it was a funny experience. But Daryl Morey versus Billy Beane. Billy Beane is different from almost everybody who has sought to emulate him. Billy Beane was the innovator in baseball. He wasn't someone who generated new baseball knowledge. He was someone who took a sledgehammer and forced a baseball organization to use new baseball knowledge, and who was very receptive to new ways of doing things. He was a transformative figure. Nobody else is. That because of Billy Beane, Daryl Morey can be who he is. Baseball is now littered with GMs and assistant GMs who are essentially stats geeks. I mean, that's their relative strength is their intelligence, their analytical abilities. And it isn't that they've played baseball. Billy Beane is not the only reason that they've got where they are, but Billy Beane is a big reason why they got where they are. So they all owe Billy Beane a thank you note. Having said that, Daryl Morey, there are a lot of really interesting characters who are geeks. Geeks by the standards of the sporting world. A geek, by the way, a geek in professional sports is someone who only played at Harvard. It's not. A lot of these people are athletes too, but they did never play professionally. And there's still room for bravery, especially intellectual bravery, in these various sports. And Maury's got a lot of it. What I love about him is that he doesn't try to hide who he is. You do find there's this tendency that when somebody who is essentially a brain for the operation gets in a position of authority in a sports franchise, they want to seem like they're a jock. They want to cozy up to the athletes. They want to be kind of one of the boys. And Darryl does not try to do that. He is who he is. Doesn't try to minimize the relative importance of his brain versus his body, and he's going to get grief. The more I can already see what's coming down the pike for him. Until he wins a championship, he will be regarded as a colorful eccentric in the NBA. He'll be regarded as someone who, yeah, he's funny, he's interesting, he's smart, but he doesn't really understand what championships are made of because he's not a basketball guy. That's the rap on a lot of the new baseball people. But then, of course, eventually they win a championship. Theo Epstein wins a championship in Boston, and he's acceptable all of a sudden. So with Darryl, I think there's going to be that battle will be waged in other sports as it's been waged in baseball, but I don't think it'll be nearly as ferocious because baseball, a lot of the issues have been sorted out in baseball first.
Michael, thank you so much for coming.
Sure.
It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you for having me.